Hello. So yeah, I'm JohnLee Cooper. My talk is called "Is a Puzzle Game Without an Undo Still a Puzzle Game?" But really, it's more about the subtitle there, the genre expectations and design considerations, and about like what happens to the design of a game and the reception of a game when you sort of forego something that's an expected quality of life feature of the genre that it's perceived as. So yeah, I'm JohnLee Cooper. I make games as for a living, and also on the side, I've made probably more than like 50 games on itch, something like that. So lots and lots of mostly pretty small games. Today, I'm going to talk about two larger games I made. I graduated from Sheridan College with a bachelor's degree in game design, and the first game we're going to talk about was like the thesis game from that program. Um, that was like more than 5 years ago now, and that was probably the last time I did a PowerPoint. So forgive me if this is a little awkward. If anything goes wrong here, that's my excuse. Um, but yeah, so we're just going to talk about two different games I made that don't have an undo and why they don't and what happened with it. And yeah, so the first one is this game called Trail Mix. It's a, I guess, yeah, it's a puzzle platformer, which, obviously that would be a lot harder to do an undo in, at least a traditional undo, because there's not specific states. I'll show a little bit of gameplay here. Oh, I can't do it in this mode. Oh, well. But basically, it's a game where two players run and jump and attach little other characters to them that changes the shape, and you end up as these walking pentominoes, which affects the way that you can cross gaps and climb over ledges and things. And so it's definitely a puzzle game with a lot of stopping and thinking and communicating required, but then it's also a platformer where there's physics and timing involved. And so why doesn't it have an undo or a rewind? A rewind would probably make more sense because again, there's no discrete steps. But why didn't we do that? So one of the reasons is because it was our student project and we only had so much time to do it. And we talked about it, and the solutions we came up with, we just kind of felt like we didn't have enough time to do them, or they just didn't quite fit our design goals, which we'll talk about in a second. But the reason that we thought we should is because there can be soft locks in the game. They're not super common because we try to avoid them with level design, but they can definitely happen just inherently by the rules of the game because you need to collect pieces to clear gaps, and then if you throw them onto the other side of the gap and go backwards, then you can no longer get them. And sort of like the openness of the level designs allows for soft lock sometimes. I'm going to show an example of one here. See if you can spot when it happens. It has already happened. It happens pretty immediately in this clip. But because they need either each other or an extra piece to cross a three-wide gap, and now they're both on different three-wide gaps away from each other, then they can't progress, and they have to restart the level. And the levels are fairly long. This is sort of partway through the first level of the game, so it's not too bad, but it's definitely a thing that can happen and a thing that can really frustrate players. So you'd think that we would want to do, an undo or save states or something. But we actually had design reasons to not want to do that as well, and they ended up winning out partially because they were on the side of it being easier to do, but partially because I think it creates some interesting situations. So our main goal in designing Trail Mix was to make a game that really focuses on like player to player communication and like real co-op where they have to think and talk to each other and sort of problem solve together. And so we wanted to steer away from the kind of puzzle design that I think a lot of like more pure puzzle games focus on, where sort of everything presented to you is a factor in the puzzle. And so you can sort of interpret what the developer wants you to do by the tools you have available and sort of have that kind of developer to player communication going on. And we sort of wanted to move away from that, which is maybe ill-advised, but we wanted to focus on player to player communication. And we feel like if they're sort of just presented with situations that may or may not be solvable or traversable, then that can present more creativity from them. And some of our favorite like things that came up in playtesting is players who would get themselves stuck in a situation and not know whether or not if they had to reset or not, and like figuring out their own solutions to not have to reset because they don't want to redo the whole level. I have some examples of that here, I think.
现在就是啊，不是搞
我们要开始俄罗斯方块了。哎，你可以拿了。
So they accidentally throw that guy in there instead of picking up the other one. It's fairly early
哦，我知道了，
in the
我知道了，我知道了。这样子，我先丢给你一个，你先拿着一个这个，然后可以把一个取出来。
我可以再长一点，对不对？
你不能再长了，你接下来一个是
我可以，我可以，
哦，你是，
我可以，
哦，可以，
我可以超级长。
进去把它弄。
They get very
哇！
excited. They get very excited when they successfully retrieve the guy from the hole and can continue on. And I mean, that's like a very early on example when they don't totally know the rules of the game yet. So they, a simple thing like that can maybe make them think that they want to reset, but they figured it out. And this is a further on in the game example where they're trying to get all of these little guys to the top left, but they've gotten one stuck in the sort of middle left corner there. And rather than restart the whole process, they do this really cool solution here, which I don't even think we use in any puzzle in the full game. They sort of made their own emergent puzzle here. And, neither of these situations would happen if they could have just completely undone. So we sort of liked the big result of having no undo in this game is that the game has stakes. And I think, I don't know, having stakes in a puzzle game kind of maybe fundamentally changes what kind of game it is. It changes the feeling. It adds like tension. So what we did instead of having an undo, we basically just have this little hole in the very beginning of the first level that kind of tricks you into falling in it and getting stuck and teaching you how to reset a level. And then we use those little skeleton assets to show an area of a level that we know might be prone to soft locking, just as kind of a warning that, oh, better be careful with your moves here. And so, yeah, people's reactions to it. I mean, I wrote here that people get mad at the lack of thing, but really all the comments that I could find as examples were like very polite, but they were just like, maybe we want to be able to rewind, which is valid. And I think it's just sort of what you expect from the kind of thinking that this game requires and from its existence as a puzzle game. Like there's no hazards and you can't die, but there are still stakes, and I think that's a weird proposition for people. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, wait, yeah, I guess I stand by it. I think in this game, I think like if anything, maybe shorter levels would just kind of lower the stakes to maybe a more comfortable place. The levels in trail mix are quite long, but I don't know. I think it's nice. It means that you can't brute force things by throwing things around. It encourages stopping and talking to your co-op partner, which supports our design goals. And I think part of why the game ended up this way, and like, well, so is it a puzzle game? Like, it's definitely still a puzzle game. Obviously, you do puzzles, and there are many puzzle games without undos, usually like physics puzzlers, things like that. But it's interesting because it sort of has a blend. We did take a lot of inspiration from Sokoban games and like very kind of core Thinky games like that, which usually do have an undo. We played a lot of Stephen Lavelle puzzle script games while we were developing it, but we also drew inspiration from like some weirder older games like Hello Kitty Cube Frenzy, which is another co-op game with a grid, but you're not just on a grid, you're also like a platformer controller running around on top of it. And Adventures of Lolo, which is a grid, but you can stand halfway between blocks and it's real time and there's enemies moving around. So I think like these sort of action puzzler influences led us to a place that's maybe a little bit outside of the genre conventions that you would expect from our game. Oh yeah, and I mentioned the tilt a couple times on the slide, but that was a funny sort of possible alternate solution to the undos that we talked about and didn't do, and I think maybe I would do for a sequel or another similar game where like kind of like in pinball, where if your ball gets stuck, you can just shake the pinball machine. I think something like that, which just shakes the physics objects around, that could maybe get you unstuck, or other solutions that are maybe sort of presented more as cheats or accessibility options rather than like an intended mechanic, might be a better balance for it. But I'm going to move on now to the other game, which is a pretty different game that also didn't have an undo that I made about a year later. And we'll talk about how that worked out. So this is Life Captivity, which is a game that combines traditional Sokoban block pushing rules with the rules of Conway's Game of Life. That's John Conway up in the top right. I think he didn't like that people mostly know him for Game of Life, but that's what I mostly know him for. So sorry, John Conway. But anyway, it's like a simple system of rules that lets complex patterns result from just a grid of alive and dead cells. And this game was sort of inspired by Puyo Tetris. I just really liked that in that game you can sort of play two different rule sets over top of each other on the same grid, and so I tried to think of other rule sets that you could do that with. It's like checkers and chess you could probably do over top of each other, and then Game of Life and Sokoban rules ended up merging together really nicely. And so this game is like far even closer to the kind of traditional Sokoban puzzle game genre where you would expect to have an undo, but it also doesn't have one. And this time it is almost entirely because I failed to implement it. I was like working on this game in my spare time after working a 9 to 5 in the day where I'm also coding, and I kind of made the original prototype a long time before and didn't implement undo because it was just a quick prototype, and then it just became very difficult to implement at the end, and I ended up just not doing it, sort of out of not wanting to rewrite everything and just wanting the game to be finished. And for a similar reason, I structured it in like a pretty traditional Sokoban way with like a linear sequence of levels. And I think in that majority of the game where it's sort of these caged in tutorializing puzzle levels, I think it really doesn't work as well as in Trail Mix to not have an undo. I think it doesn't line up as well with the design of this game. I think later on, some bigger levels that it sort of feels more like a survival element, which fits in with like the metaphor of the Game of Life rules, which is nice in that like you can try to survive and solve puzzles in multiple ways and experiment a bit more freely with this wider space and more pieces available. But I think the majority of the game, it doesn't really fit in as well, which is what it says here. But I think it just has too many other aspects working against the lack of undo. It has like pars of how many iterations of the Game of Life iterating that you need to do to beat each level, and like that kind of encourages you to optimize, which is sort of against the idea of having multiple solutions. And yeah, just the traditional Sokoban level setup. I also think, I'm saying I don't stand by it as much in this one, and I think people are like not that familiar with these Game of Life rules, and they're not super intuitive until you learned them well. So I think like being able to experiment and undo would fit this a lot better. There's no concern of it being co-op or not. There's no complex decision making in whether or not you should undo. It's just a single player game. But I think, yeah, like the alternative, if I wanted it to have that survival feeling, would be to go further in that direction and just not use a more nonlinear structure or something that supports living with the consequences of your actions. Something that supports stakes more than the traditional Sokoban structure that I did, basically that and the lack of undo were both sort of just out of burnout with the game and wanting to move on to other things. And so that's basically it. The two examples of puzzle games that I made where it ended up not having an undo and just sort of how that affected it. And I think it's just interesting to consider things that are sort of default assumptions about a genre and like what will happen if you go against these assumptions. And pulling inspiration widely can lead you to interesting results with your game. Other little lesson here: these are both free games, and so people might complain in the comments, but it's nice to release free games because you don't owe anyone anything. And so if you're ever doing that, that's a great place to really be experimental and maybe choose things that are conventionally bad design just to see what will happen. I think like people releasing free games should take advantage of that a lot. And of course, that if you're going to implement undo in a game, you should do it early before the code base gets away from you. So I guess those are my main takeaways from this. And yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear what other people think about this, if they've made games that are puzzle games with stakes, or if there's other ones that they want to recommend to me, because I feel like I haven't played too many of them. I like Void Stranger does some interesting stuff with that, of course, and like Outer Wilds is very physicsy, so you certainly have consequences in that game. Yeah, I don't know. What do other people think about this?
Thank you so much for the talk. There have actually been a bunch of comments in the chat
Nice.
pointing out other games and other games that people have made in the chat as well. So like Port Ponky was immediately appreciating your talk because he released Only Sliding. Was that this year or last year? And Only Sliding doesn't have an undo. And I think a lot of people asked for it, but Port Ponky didn't put undo in there. And yeah, somebody else was mentioning Void Stranger as well, and you just mentioned that as well. I was actually going to ask you a quick question. So you're right at the end there. You said about like implementing undo early, right? That's a
Yeah.
very common piece of advice that people share because it's hard to implement undo later. What what would you do if you were designing a game and you weren't sure whether you want the feeling of trail mix where there are situations that are a bit scary to end up in and it's hard to get out of them, versus if you weren't sure, would you just implement undo anyway and then get rid of it if it was better, or to remove it later? Or...
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like if you do implement it early, you can always just have it be toggleable and then make that decision later. But there's also something to be said for like just committing to a decision early on if you know what you're
Right.
doing.
Yeah.
Like I would say that the development of both of these games was very experimental. There wasn't much of like a strong vision going in. It was that we would make these prototypes and then iterate on them, and we would try to make the prototypes very quickly so that we could go through many iterations. And so that's sort of how we ended up in the directions we had without like this pre-made puzzle code base to turn things on and off.
Poor Ponky in the chat has described himself as an official undo hater. So
I like that. I respect that.
I also really love the idea of the tilt idea of getting out of a soft lock situation. That actually makes me think like it'd be interesting to explore that with like other types of games, like Circle Bang games, like rather than have an undo. Like what if you could just break the level in some way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I'm saying with like pulling inspiration widely. Like finding an unconventional solution for it can lead to more I don't know, just to different results.
Absolutely. All right. I think that is everything we've got. Did any other questions pop up in the chat? Lots of discussion. People talking about undo, and everybody loved the clip of the guys like figuring out how to get the character back out of that space. Like that just wouldn't have happened without if you had an undo system, right?
Yeah, it's like those are the kind of moments that we really chose to preserve when we decided to not implement a rewind or save states or anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Thank you so much. If there's no other questions, I don't think any other questions have popped up. So yeah, thank you. We'll get set up for the next talk now. So thank you, JohnLee. Applause in the chat for JohnLee. Yeah, and move on to the next one.
Thanks.